Before you get started, make sure that you have your name and hour on the back of your canvas, as well as your color schemes and the colors listed. Double check what colors you need to mix. Be sure to pour your lightest color first. Then I take a clean brush and I scoop some blue and just wipe it on the top edge of the container. Remember, your brush has to stay clean when pulling your other color. After that, I grab my small brush and I stir it up together to see what color I've made. Now, one thing that I would be careful of with this is a pretty dark color. So if this is too dark, one of the things that I could do, I'm just gonna take a little bit of white, not a ton. I'm gonna add it onto the side here. And then I'm gonna just take and mix that in and see if I can kind of lighten my purple. We're drawing our portraits with black, so we wanna have a color that the black will stand out on. So now I can kind of check it. So that one's a little bit lighter. When starting to paint your background, it's important to think about where your portrait will be placed. So I'm making a second example here, and my portrait's gonna be off to the side, to the right, so I'm going to keep that lighter, and I can go a little bit darker on the left side. You might also want to use some larger brushes since we're covering a larger area. Remember, if you plan to do any blending or mixing, the paint has to be wet, so you have to work a little quickly to get any blends to happen with your background. So here I started with purple on one side, and then I chose to add white from the other side, and then after I had my base layers in place, then I took and wiped off my large brush, so it was a dry brush, and I worked on blending the purple over into the white, creating kind of a gradient or ombre effect for the base layer of my background. One way you could add texture is by dipping your brush into a different color or contrasting color and layering it over the top of your other colors. Now remember, if the paint is still wet, it will blend in with the paint that is already there. In your tote tray, you can also find a comb that you can use to add texture to your project. So you can take the bristles of the comb and drag it through the wet paint, and it will leave lighter stripes where it is revealing the canvas underneath. You can also change directions with the brush and have overlapping texture, almost creating like a platter grid. You can also drag the tip of the comb or the back of the comb through to create larger stripes, or you could use the back of the handle of your paintbrush to do this. Now, I didn't really like the look of that, so since the paint is still wet, I can take my dry brush and just blend out the textures and the things that I just did, or soften them so they're not so noticeable. If the paint has started to dry, you can wet your brush, and that should help blend the paint and the colors in together a little better. Another tool in your tote tray that you can use to make texture is bubble wrap. So if you want it to be more subtle, you can just take the bubble wrap and place it on the wet paint, and it will lift up the paint to create light dots in the areas that you are using to remove the paint. This will show up better in a darker area than a lighter area. Then you can take and move the bubble wrap and use the paint that's on it to stamp some color in a different area. If you want the texture to be more noticeable, you can take and use your brush to paint the color onto the bubble wrap and then stamp it onto your canvas. This works well if you want to use a different color that's not already on the canvas. Another way that you can add texture to your background is to use your paper towel. This is called a lifting technique like watercolor. This works best when your paint isn't quite dry. Make sure you're checking and thinking about where your face placement would be, so that way you don't have too much texture or distracting texture in that area. If you use lighter pressure, you can also try and keep the texture lighter. You can also take your brush and brush over the edges if you want to blend the lifting technique into the other areas of your paint. Don't forget, your project doesn't have to be monochromatic, so you can pull in other colors to add details and textures to your background as well. Another way you can add texture is to drip some water onto your background, let it sit for a little while, and then dab it up with a paper towel, and it will remove that layer of paint where the water droplets were. If an area has gotten too dark, you can also take a brush with just plain water in it, brush it over the top layer, and then take your paper towel and you can lighten the paint in this area. You can also mix a tint of one of the colors where you're adding white to the color, or just work with white and brush it over the top of your color and it'll start to lighten the area. You can also take a wet brush and use it with your white or a lighter color of paint, and this can also help to lighten an area. It almost makes like a glaze or makes it a little bit more transparent when you paint over the top of it. Remember, as you start, it is okay if you don't have a lot of texture at first. This is something that we are going to build up in layers, so you can just work on blending colors and getting your main base color in place first, and then after that's finished, then come back in with your other colors that are part of your color scheme and start to add those textures, whether with your brush, whether with the comb. Don't forget, as you're adding your textures, keep in mind where your face will be in relation to the background. Also, keep in mind sometimes it's helpful to let your paint dry before you start to add more colors and textures over the top. So for example, I wanted some areas where the white stood out a little bit more, so I let the background dry so that the white would really pop in that area versus blending in with the yellow and orange in the background.